I could have spoken. That's the part that still echoes. The judge looked at me directly and asked, "Would you like to add anything before we proceed?" It was my moment, my opportunity, my chance to correct the narrative that had been building for months. And I said nothing. The courtroom wasn't dramatic the way television makes it look. No shouting, no surprises, just paperwork, fluorescent lighting, quiet shuffling of documents, the sound of my own breathing. Across the room, he sat confidently, calm, organized, represented. His attorney had just finished outlining a version of events that sounded polished, structured, clean. It wasn't entirely false, but it wasn't entirely true either. And silence has a way of turning partial truths into complete ones. My attorney leaned slightly toward me. "If you want to respond, now is the time." I nodded, but I didn't speak because I thought staying silent would make things easier. Less conflict, less hostility, less damage. That was my logic. I believed silence would show maturity, restraint, control. I didn't want the case to feel messy. I didn't want the children's names dragged into arguments. I didn't want to appear emotional. So I stayed composed, and I stayed quiet. In family court, silence isn't neutral. It's interpreted. Everything is interpreted. Body language, tone, pauses, and especially silence. When you don't correct something, the court assumes you agree with it. Agreement by absence. That's what I didn't fully understand at the time. The discussion centered around finances, assets, debt, responsibility, support. He claimed he had been carrying most of the financial burden for years, that he had paid more than his share, that he had sacrificed stability to maintain the household. None of it was completely fabricated, but it lacked context. The promotions I declined, the unpaid labor at home, the temporary part-time work I took when childcare was unpredictable. Those details weren't lies, they were simply omitted, and omission shapes perception. When the judge asked if I wanted to clarify anything, I felt my throat tighten. Not because I didn't have words, because I had too many. And words spoken under pressure can come out wrong, emotional, unstructured. I was afraid that if I spoke, I would seem defensive, so I chose restraint. Restraint felt safer. Safer than conflict, safer than contradiction, safer than being seen as difficult. In American courtrooms, presentation matters. Calmness matters. Control matters. I wanted to appear reasonable, cooperative, above the tension, so I let the record stand as it was presented. Half complete, half contextualized, fully accepted. The hearing moved forward. Numbers were reviewed, timelines were confirmed, responsibilities were assigned. Everything felt procedural, almost harmless, until it wasn't. When the temporary financial order was read aloud, I felt something shift inside me. Not shock, recognition. The numbers reflected the version of events that had gone unchallenged. His version, because silence doesn't defend you, it validates the last thing said. The judge finalized the temporary arrangement, pending further review. And just like that, the structure of my financial future had shifted. Quietly, legally, officially. My attorney looked at me afterward and asked gently, "Are you sure you didn't want to clarify anything?" I swallowed. "It's fine," I said. But it wasn't fine. It was permanent enough to matter, and temporary orders often shape permanent outcomes. That's what no one explains clearly. The first impression in court can become the framework for the final decision, and I had let the first impression stand uncontested. Not because I didn't care, because I thought silence was strength. I thought silence protected my dignity. I didn't realize silence was expensive. The order didn't feel real until the first payment cycle passed. That's when it became tangible. Court decisions don't arrive loudly. They arrive in deposits, in deductions, in numbers that quietly alter your stability. The temporary financial arrangement required me to contribute more than I expected, more than I had prepared for, more than felt proportionate to reality. But proportion isn't based on feelings, it's based on the record. And the record reflected what had been presented, not what had been omitted. The first month, I adjusted. I reduced discretionary spending, delayed plans, shifted savings. Temporary inconvenience, I told myself. Temporary orders. Temporary impact. But temporary decisions often create long-term patterns. The second month, the strain became noticeable. I had to move money from savings to cover overlapping expenses. Not because I was irresponsible, because the structure had changed. And structure dictates outcome. The court had interpreted our financial history through the lens that had gone unchallenged. He appeared as the primary contributor. I appeared as the secondary support. Not because it was entirely accurate, because it was uncontested. In American family courts, perception influences distribution. Judges operate on presented evidence, presented context, presented numbers. And silence removes context. I remember sitting at my dining table reviewing my budget, the same table where I once helped the kids with homework, the same table where bills were once shared discussions. Now it felt like a negotiation desk. I wasn't angry at him, not fully. I was frustrated with myself because I had confused emotional maturity with strategic restraint. I believed avoiding conflict would protect everyone, but avoiding correction had protected only one version of events. And that version was financially advantageous for him. My attorney called a week later. "We can request modification," she said carefully, "but it's harder to change a structure once it's set." Harder? Not impossible, but uphill. Because the first hearing shapes momentum. Momentum shapes narrative. Narrative shapes outcome. That's how legal systems work. They build forward, not backward. The silence that felt calm in the courtroom now felt heavy in my living room. I replayed the moment over and over. The judge's question, "Would you like to add anything?" My pause, my choice, my silence. At the time, it felt controlled. Now it felt costly. Financially costly, emotionally costly, strategically costly. I started noticing other small consequences. Credit utilization increased slightly because I leaned on my card during tighter months. Not dramatically, but enough to matter. Savings growth slowed, long-term plans felt uncertain. Temporary orders ripple. They don't just affect the current month, they influence momentum, and momentum determines stability. One evening, while reviewing documents again, I realized something critical. The court didn't know the full picture because I hadn't provided it. The judge didn't misunderstand. The judge evaluated what was presented, and I had presented nothing. Silence in court isn't neutrality, it's consent to proceed with the existing narrative. I had assumed fairness would automatically balance itself, but fairness in legal systems is structured through evidence and argument, not assumption. I wasn't punished, I wasn't mistreated, I was evaluated based on incomplete information, and incomplete information leads to incomplete outcomes. That's when the internal shift began. Not anger, not regret. Clarity. Clarity that silence had not protected me, it had simplified the room for everyone else. Simplified means easier. Easier means faster. Faster means less detailed. Less detailed means less accurate. I began preparing documentation. Not to attack, not to accuse, to clarify. Because clarification is not conflict. Clarification is correction. And correction requires voice. The next hearing date was already scheduled, and this time I understood something I hadn't before. Silence might feel dignified, but dignity doesn't adjust court orders. Evidence does, voice does, structure does. The next time the judge asked if I wanted to add anything, I wouldn't hesitate. The second hearing felt different before it even began. Not because the courtroom had changed. It hadn't. Same fluorescent lights, same wooden benches, same quiet shuffle of documents. But I had changed. The first time, I had entered hoping for peace. This time, I entered prepared for clarity. There's a difference. Peace avoids friction. Clarity addresses distortion. My attorney had spent the weeks prior reorganizing everything: income timelines, career sacrifices, childcare adjustments, emails, bank records. Not emotional arguments, documented facts. Facts don't raise their voices, they simply exist. When the hearing began, his attorney repeated much of the earlier narrative: primary earner, financial strain, unequal contribution. The same structure that had shaped the temporary order. But this time, when the judge finished reviewing the summary and turned toward me, the question returned. Would you like to add anything? The room felt just as quiet as before, but the silence didn't intimidate me, because I understood something now. Silence doesn't preserve dignity, it surrenders narrative. I stood, not dramatically, not emotionally, calm, measured, prepared. Yes, Your Honor, I said. And then I clarified. I explained the promotions I declined to maintain childcare stability. I explained the part-time transitions. I explained the months when my income decreased intentionally to keep our household functioning. Not defensively, not aggressively, contextually, because context changes perception, and perception influences structure. My attorney submitted supporting documentation, email chains, tax returns, work contracts, objective evidence, not accusations. Evidence doesn't argue, it adjusts. The judge listened carefully, asked questions, reviewed numbers again, and something subtle shifted. Not sympathy, recalibration. Courts are designed to adjust when presented with clearer information, but clarity must be offered. It doesn't insert itself. The revised financial review didn't erase the temporary order, but it modified the long-term structure. Support distribution changed. Contribution percentages adjusted. Future obligations balanced differently. Not dramatically, but meaningfully. Meaningfully is what matters in financial outcomes, because meaningfully affects stability. When the session ended, I didn't feel victorious. I felt aligned. Aligned with reality. Aligned with my contribution. Aligned with the record. The first hearing had taught me something expensive. The second hearing reinforced something powerful. In American courtrooms, voice is structural. It shapes record. Record shapes order. Order shapes life. Silence may feel mature, but systems interpret silence as agreement, and agreement has consequences. Walking out of the courthouse, I felt lighter, not because conflict had ended, because ambiguity had. Ambiguity drains confidence. Clarity restores it. The financial adjustments wouldn't instantly repair the months of strain, but they restored fairness to the structure moving forward, and structure determines trajectory. I realized something many people misunderstand. Staying silent to avoid appearing difficult often creates larger difficulties later. Legal systems aren't emotional arenas, they're procedural environments. Procedures rely on input, and if you don't provide input, the system proceeds without it. I hadn't been punished for silence. I had simply allowed an incomplete picture to become the official one, and official pictures shape official outcomes. The lesson wasn't about speaking loudly. It was about speaking precisely, about correcting respectfully, about protecting your own narrative. Because if you don't protect your narrative in court, someone else will define it for you. And once defined, it takes effort to undo. The second hearing didn't make me stronger. It made me clearer. Clear about responsibility, clear about documentation, clear about the cost of restraint when structure is at stake. I had stayed silent once, and it had cost me. I wouldn't stay silent again when clarity was required. Not out of anger, out of responsibility. To myself. If you've ever been in court, did you speak up or stay silent? Leave a comment. What would you do differently today? Your experience could help someone facing the same situation. And don't forget, like, share, and subscribe for more Untold American Lives.